I appreciate that reading, Ronnie. Thank you for the prayer, Jim, and the song leading by Jeff. It's good to be here. It's good to see everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Sandyville Church of Christ. The time is now that God requires us to worship Him in spirit and in truth. We have the right spirit. We recognize that. We want that. And we pray that this worship service will be pleasing to God, edifying to you, and build us all up in the kingdom, man. We pray that we have the right information to be offered to God and that we preach the truth as declared in this place that is able to save your souls. Let's look beginning this morning. I want to look at some events that happened in Daniel chapter 1. They were given great Hebrew names that we really don't remember them by, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Two of those Hebrew names have reference to the word Jehovah. One of those names has reference to the word God or Yahweh. Great Hebrew names, and really they were good boys. But they were born in a very, very bad time in Israel's history. A time when the wicked king Nebuchadnezzar invaded their home, their town, invaded Jerusalem, and took them hundreds of miles away from where they were born and raised into a place called Babylon. And first thing King Nebuchadnezzar did was change those names. He wanted to get all remembrance of God out of those boys' names, and there are names that we're really familiar with: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now those names refer in some slant or some form to idols, to paganism. So they were named after the idols that were in Babylon. What we learn about these young men were that they were very handsome. They were very intelligent. They were very smart, very well cultured, especially for their age. In verse 4, the first thing that Nebuchadnezzar did was he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The first order of business was to get their past out of their minds and to put in them to worship the false gods, the false idols, and to recognize what Chaldean worship was. Then we look at verse 8. They made up their minds, along with Daniel, that they were not going to defile themselves by eating the king's diet. What that entailed was meat sacrificed to idols. Also, there was a lot in the Mosaic writing, in the writings of Moses, about how to prepare food, and a lot of this was unsanitary to them. They asked and were given the opportunity to eat of their diet. Pulse, I believe some passages or some versions say, but it was vegetables, that what a lot of them say, but really it is the saying of the seed. Vegetables included also fruit as well as grains. But after 10 days, they looked better than all of those that were around them, and then because of that stand that they took, they were allowed really to use that diet, I think, as long as they were there, especially those 3 years that they were in training before they stood in front of the king. And then we see in I think it's around verse 20, he says, "In every matter of wisdom, here they are before the king, and understanding about which the king inquired them, he found them 10 times better than everyone, because of God was with them." And God blessed them really in their stand. He rewarded them. However, if you know anything about Daniel, this first chapter and this what happened to them really was a foretaste with what was really going to happen to them come along chapter 3. And to look at what kind of faith that they had to have in chapter 3, these three men, Daniel wasn't there during this time. It was a faith that I can't imagine sometimes. It was a faith that required them to deny the king, and it meant that they were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. Let's take a look at the story again. Chapter 3, there are a few things that I want to look at for us to help us to remember, and I've got it on your handout there. All those words there, the first three you notice begins with C, but it's a good way to help us remember that. Verse 5 of chapter 3, notice that he says this: "You're to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar set up." Now that's a pretty simple command. Here's an idol. The king says to you, you need to worship that idol. That's it. That's the command. That's the command that was given to them. Well, they decided to refuse to that very clear message that King Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to do. Well, because of that refusal, there's a consequence that they must face. Next verse, verse 6. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into, he says, the burning fiery furnace. If you don't obey, this is what's going to happen. All right? Well, very clear what to do, very clear what's going to happen if you don't do it. So they made, another C word, they made a choice. Verse 12, certain Jews who you've appointed, these are men, certain time, the Chaldeans, these are certain men, they're appointed over the affairs of them. These men, all right, talking about those that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They made a choice not to do that. Now, in an odd twist, I'm looking at that. I don't think they're really refusing the king. They are in essence, but really I think the way these guys, they're putting words in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's mouth, they're not, they're going to refuse to worship that idol. Of course, the way they explained to the king, it made him really mad. All right, and so in an odd twist, I look at that, and it looks like they were given a second chance when you read it. It looks like Nebuchadnezzar, he just goes to him, and you know what? You just really don't understand the weight of this. You don't understand the gravity of what you're refusing to do. Look down about verse 15. Now, I'm going to give you another chance. There's a C word, it's probably not in your outline. I'm going to give you another chance to do the right thing. Verse 15. Now, if you're ready, like you weren't ready before, you didn't seem to understand what I meant before. Now, if you're ready, the king says, now if you're ready, when you hear the music, when you hear all the music, you fall down and worship the image that I have made, he says, well and good. And you know the story. Let's look at the story. Verse 21. Then those men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their garments. They were thrown into the burning fiery furnace because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated 7 times, some say. The flame of the fire killed those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselor, did we not cast 3 men bound to the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. Now we know the story. They came out of the fire unscathed. They didn't even smell like smoke. They'd been in a fiery furnace, and we know that they didn't smell like smoke. What happened was God saved them. And he sent this angel, this messenger, if you want another C word, we could call that cherub, but to protect them and to defend them in the consequence that they were in. I've known this story for a long time. And I suspect that most of the people here know that story. And you know what? Making application from that story as a preacher really isn't that easy. I don't think I can flippantly say, now here's these 3 guys, they defied the king, they're not going to worship the idol, they get thrown in the fire furnace. Let me tell you how that parallels with our life. I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if it's that easy. I've never had to face that. You don't know what that's like either. You're a teenager, a young teenager, we're attacked, here comes the enemy, they haul you off to a foreign land, and they demand that you deny God and worship idols, and you deny that you're going to worship idols. I'm going to stay true to the true and living God. And they say, well, you're going to die. Now, I have a hard time getting a parallel there because I've never known that, never been faced with that. I'm thankful we don't have to operate that way. I'm thankful that God doesn't operate that way anymore these days. You know what? If somebody were to throw you in a fire furnace today, you know what would happen to you? You die. So there's a big difference in then and thou. But I look at that, and so how do we apply their circumstances to our lives? There is a common connection, I think, between them and us. And that connection is on whatever level it might be, whatever time in history it might be, wherever we're at, as disciples of Christ, we have always been faced to make decisions. And the main decision is, are we going to put God first no matter what? I think that's what we parallel with them. Putting God first no matter what. That's our decision. I think that's what we have, that common connection with them. They were asked to make a decision. Here's an idol. You need to worship that. Or are you going to hold to your God? They made the decision. And now when you move to the New Testament, a little closer to home, New Testament Christians, we can basically really almost recognize and say, Paul gave up a lot of things. Paul gave up his home, his fortune, his family, his friends, for what? To prove that God comes first no matter what. Jason, thrown out on the streets, out of his home in Thessalonica. For what? To prove that God comes first no matter what. Think about Stephen. And after that sermon, and his fiery trial ended in his death, being stoned with rocks. Right there. There was no salvation for there as far as his physical salvation was. But why did he do that? Why, after he said what he said, would he bring the stones on? Because he's going to prove God comes first no matter what. 1 Peter chapter 4 offers a parallel, I think, in the New Testament to Daniel chapter 3. There's a common connection there facing any kind of trial, I think, for the sake of Christ. All right, let's look. Now notice that he's not talking to Jewish teenagers in Babylon. Peter is talking to everybody in this room this morning, every one of us. Verse 12, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and God rest upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or as an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God, and if it begins with us, what will the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let us who suffer according to God's will entrust your souls to a faithful Creator while doing good, or while doing right. They were facing great trials and tribulation in the first century when Peter wrote this, not unlike, to some degree, what we share in common with them also. All right? They are called through, or Peter calls them, fiery ordeals. And I think all of us, as a Christian, many times meet those fiery ordeals. And there's some things, as you read the account of Peter, that really kind of jump off the page when you read those words as a Christian. And you look at it, and really the first thing, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised that you know what, I think sometimes Christians are just blown away. You mean this is going to hurt? You mean I'm going to have to feel some pain? You mean there's people not going to like me? You mean this is how it's going to be sometimes if you make a stand for putting God first, no matter what? Is this how it is? Yeah. That's exactly what it means sometimes to be a Christian. It means, and Peter says, that you're going to suffer. Don't be surprised if you're put in some predicament that's not comfortable, that you might have a little suffering in a fiery trial. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not surprised. They were ready. They were prepared. Another thing I think jumps off the page is, let's not try to avoid fiery trials or those trials that come of us at all costs. Seems like sometimes the goals of the Christian is to see how much they can do and how much they can get as close as they can without having to do what? Give up anything. The guy that dies with the most toys wins. I've seen that bumper sticker. But the guy that makes it to heaven, who gave up the least, he wins. Think about that way. I think a lot of us view it that way. I want to make it, and when I get there, if I didn't give up as much stuff to get there as you did, I win. Avoid that trial. But you know what? I don't think so. We are to embrace the challenges that come our way. We are to embrace the things that come our way, the difficulties, the sacrifices. What for? They're proof that we put God first no matter what. Another thing that jumps off the page is, don't you be surprised, don't avoid sacrifice. But number 3 is that let's face this, and let's face this trial well. We're going to do this. We're going to do it right. And we're going to face it like a Christian. We're going to face it like we should. I want to be tempered. I want to be tested. I want to be firmed up because of what's happening to me. I want to look at it right. I look at that, and I look at Daniel 3 to the extent of that story, and I think that's very helpful for us. You know, if I can see those men, if I can learn how these three men walked into a fiery furnace, if I can learn how they did that, I learned those characteristics that they had to do that. If I can learn that, then I'll tell you what, and put that in my life, I want that kind of courage. I want to have that similar courage that they had. Let's go back to Daniel 3. Now, I want to look at a few things that allowed them to be successful in facing this fiery trial. But before we do that, and all of our points are going to come from verse 28 on your handout. But before we talk about that, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Because this sermon, this story, these points that we're going to make this morning, they're not for everyone. These points are not for everyone. Whatever they did, however they did it, however they made it through, they did so with one purpose, and one purpose in mind. Verse 28, so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Are we all together on this? Is this why you came here this morning? To worship and serve the true and living God this day? Do you serve any other gods? Are we on the same page as the same page that they were on? Verse 28. We're here this morning because we accept God as the only true and living God. Well, this lesson, this story, their life is for people who want to do right. If you don't want to do right, this lesson's not for you. If you live a life of sin, this lesson's not for you. If you don't care about trials that come up, you don't even call them trials because you yield to Satan every time, this lesson isn't about you. If you're living a life after the wrong guy, this lesson's not for you. This lesson is about someone that wants to do right. Someone that faces a trial. Someone that wants to overcome a trial. Somebody that wants to beat the thing and stand with God when it's all over. After the dust is settled, after all the flames have been extinguished, and you're through that fiery trial, it's you and God. This lesson's for you. That's what I want. Verse 28. Now here is the first and foremost thing that they did, I think, that allowed them to maintain their faith through this kind of trial. Before any of the hard stuff comes along, notice what it says. They put their trust in God. God is here. God is here. God is watching. God cares about me. God knows what I'm going through. God recognizes it. God understands. My choices matter to God. I trust God. I don't say that enough. How about you? I like the way that sounds. I don't say that enough. I trust God. In a fiery trial. Listen, the language that they used a little bit earlier, look at verse 17. He says this, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. You know what? They weren't sure what God was going to do. They didn't know for sure or not if they were going to save them or if he was going to let them burn. Because in the first part of verse 18, but if not. But if not. And so they looked at that. They didn't know if he's going to bring them out safely or if they were going to be consumed by the fire. Well, whatever God saves us, he does. Or if he doesn't save us. Their attitude was it didn't make any difference. It actually doesn't matter. You know why? Because we trust God. It doesn't matter the outcome. And we know no matter what happens to us that God has our best interest in his heart. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6. Without faith it is impossible to please God. It's impossible to please God unless you trust God. When you come to God, you must believe that he is and that he is a rewarder of those that trust him, that diligently seek him. Folks, I'll tell you why I read that verse. That has nothing to do with circumstances. It doesn't matter if you're in a trial or not in a trial. It doesn't matter if you're on fire or you're not on fire. It doesn't matter if you make it or you don't make it. The bottom line in that, God is. God is. And God in his own way, in his own time, will reward you that diligently seek him. Why? Because you trust him. I trust God. I think that's in that passage. Let's go back to Peter. Have you noticed we're going to flip them back and forth? That's what we're going to do a little bit. Let's go back to 1 Peter chapter 4. I want to see here that he's addressing the faithfulness of Christians through fiery ordeals. But faith and trust is critical in this. Let's look at verse 13 again. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when this glory is revealed, he says. Well, if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. Why am I blessed when I suffer? Why am I blessed when I'm insulted? Why am I blessed when I'm mistreated as a Christian? Why? Well, look what he says. Because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Now, I got to confess, I don't totally understand what that means. I don't know what that means, but I like it. I like the way that sounds. Now, I don't know if I necessarily have to know what that means, but I understand it. I can understand what it means. It means that, listen, when you're suffering like that, you can trust God. You can trust God. Well, he always gives that to us. Look at verse 19. Therefore, let those who what? Suffer. According to God, what? He will entrust. If you're suffering, you have not lost through that suffering. Trust God. Now listen, there are fiery trials that all of us endure. We endure fiery trials with our families. We endure fiery trials with our friends. We endure fiery trials with those that we have recreation with, those out at our occupation. And the way that you've ordered your priorities, they may be unique to you and you alone. In our life that's out there, we all have different things that affect us. But the trials might be unique. But what is common to all disciples is that none of it really matters to us. Yes, you have some unique things going on. I do too. But there's something in common, folks. We all have to trust in God. We all must do that. And I trust God will help me overcome that. Any trial that I have, I will prove that he will come first no matter what. No matter what. Let's go back to Daniel. Verse 28, after he said that he made the decision to trust God no matter what, notice what he says. He goes on to say, they violated the king's command. You know, it's one thing to say God's great. It's one thing to say God's great, that you trust him, that you love him, that you know that he's going to get you through everything, that God's just the greatest. But it's something else entirely when you look at the most powerful man in the world and you look at him in the face and you say, no. No. I don't care if you kill me. I don't care what you do with me. The answer is no. And I think about that in my life. That's the kind of faith where the proverbial rubber meets the road, where the faith meets that rocky terrain, where your faith is tested. That's where that is. You know, a disciple is someone who is disciplined into doing what? The right thing. Not maybe, not I might, not God will understand this time through this fiery trial. No. No. That might be the strongest word in the language of a Christian. No. There was no compromise. Isn't there some way we can find room here to make some of us a little happier? I think we can make everybody, look. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy, I'll tell you what, if you're going to live a Christian life, those that will live godly will be what? Persecuted. You're going to be persecuted. If you and I really put this God first, I'm going to tell you something. There's going to be times when everybody around you is not happy. Somebody's going to have to hear the word no. No, I'm not going to do it. No, I'm not going to go there. No, I'm not going to say that. No, I'm not going to be like that. No, I'm not going to miss church. No. You look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They really didn't have to tell the king no. You know that? That story. Look at verse 16. The no was understood. The no was obvious. Their character before this event was so fully proven to Nebuchadnezzar, they didn't even have to say no. Look at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Why not? Why don't you remember who we are? You know who we are. We've been here long enough, and all the times of our life, didn't we defy you every time something like this comes up? Do I really have to tell you no? Isn't the answer, King Nebuchadnezzar, that I'm not going to bow down to this? Isn't the answer obvious to you? They didn't even have to tell him no. I'll tell you what, that's strong, folks. That's strong. You're telling the most powerful man, Nebuchadnezzar, in the world to his face, I'm going to violate your command. You kidding me? I don't even have to tell you no. You know. Well, anybody can sing about how great Jesus is, how wonderful it is to be a Christian. Anybody can do that. But are we willing to say no to the world? Are we? Turn back to 1 Peter, verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a meddler. He's talking about suffering. And you know what kind of suffering that verse is? That's the kind of suffering we all can do. That's a piece of cake. We can all suffer by making wrong decisions. I've made more wrong decisions than you. And I've suffered for them. You have too. Well, if you murder, you're going to suffer. If you steal, you lie, you cheat, you're going to suffer. Anybody can do that. That's what he says. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God, he says, in the name. Well, they suffered. They suffered because they said, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to take part in that. And then for that, they suffered. Who among us here this morning is so set on serving God that your no goes without even asking? Do you have that reputation with the people that you know, that they don't even have to ask you if God comes first? Is that the reputation that you have? You've got a job here, good sound church, good people. You've got this opportunity that's going to take you away from this congregation, move your family, going to pay you a little bit more. You might have a better RV. Do you go? Do you consider it? Is the answer obvious? How about your friends? Hey, listen, we're going to go, and we want you to go, and why are you asking me? Why are you even asking me to do that? Doesn't my life, hasn't the things that I've said to you before, doesn't our relationship, do I even have to say no? I can't even believe you're at. Is that your life? Is that the reputation that you have? Are we involved in things that have us saying no to God way more than it should? Because I'm going to tell you something. Things always say no to God. Always. I'm trying to prove that God comes first no matter what. I'll tell you what, sometimes family can be the worst enemy of all time. Young blood can be the worst enemy of all time. Stay home. You need to study the Bible. What are you doing that for? What's this? What's that? And sometimes family's the hardest time to say no to. Can't you just stay home tonight? They don't even need to ask. Is your reputation as a Christian to everybody that you know to the point where they don't even need to ask, that they already know that the answer is no because you're going to serve God first, no matter what? I'll tell you something. People don't like to hear it. They don't like to hear no. Nebuchadnezzar didn't like to hear no. That heat was turned up. It made him fiery mad. He turned it up big time. Your friends don't enjoy hearing no. Your family doesn't enjoy hearing no. Your boss does not enjoy hearing no. Your teammates do not enjoy hearing no. But who? Who will say it anyway? I pray we don't say no to God. Well, they violated the king's command, Daniel chapter 3. And in verse 28, they were willing to take this. How far? As far as is necessary to take it. What's he say? They had what? The text says they yielded up their bodies. You could say that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego died for God. They bound them. They took them up there to the fiery furnace, and they threw them in. You know what they did when that point happened? They gave their lives to God. They sacrificed their lives to God. God just so happened to save them. It's kind of like Abram when he offered his son Isaac, Genesis chapter 22. When he did that, the Hebrew writer says, what's he say about it? Abraham offered his son Isaac. It doesn't say Abraham almost. Boy, he come now offering. He offered his son to Isaac. He killed his son for God. That's what Abraham did. God just so happened again to step in and stop him. These men offered the ultimate sacrifice. They gave their lives. When the trial was there, Whatever it takes. We'll go all the way with this. Verse 18 again. If he does not, even this day if I die, I will die for God because I trust him. I want to put him before everything else. Well, remember 1 Peter chapter 4, the very first part, 12. Entrust your souls to God. Something really amazing happens in the course of this lesson, this story. They're thrown into this furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's there. Look what happens in verse 25. Let's go back to Daniel again. Verse 25. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound. It's Nebuchadnezzar. Walking in the midst of the fire. They are not hurt. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Here Nebuchadnezzar is, most powerful man in the world, looking in this furnace, seeing these men in there, and their bodies are preserved. They're without harm. You know what he wants? I'll take 4 of them. That's what I want. That's amazing. That's incredible. That's impossible. I want that. Get them out of there. This is what I want. That's unbelievable. That's the kind of body I want. They were bodies that were preserved and could never be destroyed. You know the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar missed during that, when he's seen all that? You know, if you want one of those bodies that are preserved like those bodies were preserved in that fiery trial, you want one of those bodies? Nebuchadnezzar, do you want one of those bodies? Then you're going to have to sacrifice this one. You're going to have to sacrifice this flesh in those fiery trials. If you want a body that's going to last forever through every fire that ever is known and will be preserved forever and ever, you want that body forever? You need to sacrifice the one you've got. That's the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar never got. He didn't get that. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they got that. They sacrificed their body. And as a result of that, it was preserved. Their body was saved. They yielded it up to the Lord. You know, I'm thankful again that we don't live in a place and a time where the most stringent sacrifices and the most stringent trials and the awfulest things that we live through is about a job or a family member, or it's about a no-show at a few commitments that the world thinks is so vital. I look back at my life and the things that I gave up for the Lord that I thought was such a great sacrifice isn't anything. It's pitiful when you compare your sacrifices that you make for being a Christian and you read this story. It's pitiful. It's pitiful. But there are decisions that hurt our flesh. There are things that we violate when it comes to God, when we give in to those trials. And I think that's how Peter finishes that section in verse 19. That those things that we go through, 1 Peter chapter 4, no matter how far, how bad it is, even to the point of death, we can trust God. God will do what's right. You ever wonder what you'd do? I wonder about this a lot of times. You ever wonder what you'd do if somebody pull a gun on you, stick it to your head, and say, defy your faith right now, or I'm going to blow your brains out? You ever think about that? Now that's kind of the situation they were in. You know what? All you have to do is say that you don't believe in God, and I'll just let this safety off, and we'll just go on home. You don't have to worry about it. Do you ever think about what you would do if that was put on the line, your life was put on the line for the very convictions that we're assembled here together today for? Have you ever thought about how you would answer somebody about that? You've already know the answer. You know it right now. Because the decisions that you make every single day between God and man reflect the answer that you would give for that situation. Every single day when you are called to make a decision whether to put God first or man first, you've made that decision thousands of times. So when it comes to the ultimate decision, putting your life on the line, you've already answered. You already know how you'd answer. Every choice that we make every day answering a question, What would we do? God first or man? You've answered the ultimate question. Romans chapter 12 talks about your bodies being a living sacrifice. How can we do that? Because you trust God. One final thing I want us to notice. This great sermon, not my sermon, but the words that are written in Daniel's great sermon. It's a great lesson. That verse 28, it's a great verse. And it ends with such a great line. And it would be great, God would preach that sermon and say, you know, I want to tell you a story about three men, that they stood the ultimate test, the ultimate trial, and they withstood the king, the greatest man in the world, the most powerful man in the world. It's a great, but you know what? God didn't preach this lesson. You know who preached this lesson? The evil, the godless, the heathenistic, the murderous Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the one that preached this sermon. Let's look at verse 28. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command, yielded up their bodies rather than serve the worship any god except their own God." That's awesome. What a lesson. What a lesson from a heathen who earlier denounced God, the true and the living God. And he preaches one of the greatest lessons in Daniel. What a lesson that we learn from a heathen. Well, what are you, really, I think about all of that. What's the results? What are the results when we go through the fiery trials and we remain faithful to God? When you and I make those hard choices and we stand by our commitments that we put God first no matter what. What's the results? You ever think about it? You know, one of the greatest things, we talk about evangelism. I'm going to look at 1 Peter. I think it's chapter 2. Let's go back over there. I'll read this verse. He says this, verse 12. "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable." Why is that? "So that when they speak against you as evildoers, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God," he says, "in the day of salvation." Do you know why Nebuchadnezzar glorified God? Because they seen him in them. We talk about evangelism. We talk about telling our families, our friends, our neighbors, inviting our neighbors and friends to church, handing out tracts, doing what we can to convert a lost and dying world. Eternity's coming. Eternity's definitely coming. But you know what the number one way to tell people how great God is? You know what the number one way is? Is to show them how great God is by your life, by the decisions that you make, by the no's in your life. And you know what? After a while, you keep telling the world no, they're not going to ask you anymore. And you know what? When they stop asking you to do ungodly things, do you know something? You've made progress. If there's a chance that you'll show up where you shouldn't and sacrifice God, they'll keep asking. But when you said no long enough, that's progress. And there'll be a point in their life when they'll stop asking no. But I'll tell you what they'll do. They'll start wondering why you always say yes to God. And that's when you make a difference in this world that we live in. That's when you make a difference in the lives of the people that you know. Why does he always say yes to God? Why is God first in his life? What if God could ask your neighbors? What if God could ask your friends? The people that you work with? You know what? He makes me think about you. His life, what he does, is he's the only reason I've ever even thought about you, God. How would the Nebuchadnezzars in your life answer to God about your life? About the impact that you've made in their lives. What would they say to God about you? Are you ready for that kind of judgment? If you're not ready for that kind of judgment, you can be. If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you can obey the gospel this day. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. If you need the prayers of this good church, if you're not ready for that kind of judgment. You sin in the public way, you deny God all the time, you don't even have a trial in your life because you're not even living for God. And that's publicly known. You want to make that right? You can do that this day. We'll pray to God with you. He'll forgive you. This congregation will too. Please come as together we stand and sing.